Speaker's Corner aboard the Villa Vie Odyssey, hosted by Kit Cassingham.
Welcome to Speaker's Corner. Hey. It's nice to see people here tonight. It's always nice to see people at Speaker's Corner.
We had a tough competition tonight, Harry Potter.
Oh, Harry Potter's showing tonight.
Oh, yeah.
Bye, Robert. We gotta go. No, I'm here to. I've seen Harry Potter before, but I have not seen this talk of Robert's. He has written on this topic, and he's spoken a lot about it to us. But this particular talk is about how Christians have commemorated Holy Week from Palm Sunday to Easter, and how it's always played a special role in Jerusalem as the place where the events occurred. This talk will see that the various Christian denominations, what they have done in post-Crusader Mamluk?
Mamluk, that's the dynasty name, Mamluk.
Okay, dynasty of Mamluk, and the Ottoman periods up to World War I. He's going to focus on the Orthodox miracle of the Holy Fire in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Catholic Stations of the Cross, as well as Prophet Moses' pilgrimage by the Muslim population of Jerusalem as a counter for these Christian activities. So I think you're going to get a real interesting mix and blend of Jewish, Christian, Muslim, etc. activities. So with that, let's welcome Robert Schick to talk about how did Christians in Jerusalem commemorate Holy Week in pre-modern times. Robert.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, and I'm glad to see you all here. It's a topic that I have been studying for a lot of my career. In addition to my work in Jordan, I've spent a lot of years in Jerusalem, and so I've become very familiar with what goes on in medieval and later times. Now, I'm going to focus my attention just how then the Christians in Jerusalem, both the resident Christian population as well as short-term pilgrims, how they commemorate or have commemorated Holy Week over these centuries. Now I'm going to focus my attention on the period after the Crusades. Now, there are two dynasties who rule, well, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Mamluk dynasty with the capital in Cairo from 1260 to 1516, and then you have the Ottoman Empire conquers the area in 1516, and they rule up until 1917 in the end of World War I. So it's that Mamluk and Ottoman periods that I'm going to focus my attention on. Now, the size of Jerusalem's population is in the low tens of thousands. There's some statistics in the early Ottoman period that have the Muslims, the solid majority of the population, and then the Christians and Jews with a much smaller population, more or less the same size with the Christians and Jews living in the city. And in this case, it's like 15,000 is the total population of the city, with the Muslims in the solid majority. And there are some other, not so reliable statistics that come up with the Greek Orthodox Christians being the largest Christian denomination in the city, Armenians second, and then there are Copts, Syrians, smaller numbers of others, Ethiopians, Assyrians, whatever, with this figure giving a total of 700 Christians in 1529. Now, what's interesting, Catholics are not on that list. There were no Catholics at all in Jerusalem in the first decades after the Crusades, and even after the Franciscan custody of the Holy Land gets established in 1342, there are no lay Catholics living in the city. The Catholics are either Franciscans, the monastic order that the Catholic Church places in charge of pilgrimage, both to see to the physical upkeep of the various churches and holy places, and their other task is to see that pilgrimage is conducted in an orderly fashion. But there really aren't any Catholic lay population in the city in the Mamluk period. It's only in the Ottoman period that you start to get Catholics living in the city. So that's why Catholics don't make that list I just showed you a moment ago. Well, now Holy Week is the busiest time of the year for Christians. And then you also have, at the same time, Jews are celebrating Passover in the city. Now, the Jews are able to reestablish a stable community in Jerusalem starting in 1267. There were no Jews at all in the Crusader period because the Crusaders in 1099 slaughter the entire non-Christian population. All the Muslims and Jews in the city are killed in 1099, and there are very few Muslims, essentially no Jews, living in the city during the Crusader period, but only once the Crusade period comes to an end and you then have Mamluk rule, you once again have a Jewish population. Now, I'm not going to say much more about the Jews, except, well, they do commemorate Passover. They have learned that it's best to not draw attention to themselves. So they're an internal focused community, and nothing untoward happens. They commemorate Passover. Passover comes and goes, and the Muslims and Christians don't care what's going on, so things go smoothly enough for the Jews commemorating Passover. And so I'm going to focus my attention on the Christians and what all they do. Well, with Jerusalem being the place where all of the incidents happen, that provides an opportunity for the Christians to develop what's called a stational liturgy. During Holy Week, you will want to go to the place where the event happened that you want to commemorate. And so you have a proliferation of holy places in the city and elsewhere in the Holy Land. Essentially every place mentioned in the gospel account of the Passion of Christ is going to have a church built there, and you are going to want to go there at the time that the event happened during Holy Week. And so you then have the practice from the very beginning in the 4th century when Christianity becomes a licit religion in the Roman Empire, of people having a regular schedule during the days of Holy Week to go to the place like the Garden of Gethsemane or the church up on the Mount of Olives where Jesus instructs the disciples and whatever. You want to go there and hold some sort of church service. And so this is a regularly organized schedule of events from the very beginning. And so at each of these holy places, you're going to have an early Christian Byzantine church, and then the Crusaders will build another big church when they are ruling the city. And then you have another third phase of a modern European building there. So you have this stationary liturgy being practiced from the beginning. Now, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, called by the Eastern Rite churches the Church of the Resurrection, is the most important of these Christian holy places, and it is then the focus of attention during especially Good Friday through Easter. And all of the Christian denominations want to have a presence in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and so it's less edifying to be aware of all the rivalries between the different Christian denominations who are competing for who controls which portions of the church. Well, that's an unedifying aspect of the activities in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Mamluk through early Ottoman period, until the Ottomans simply impose a status quo as to who is in control of which altar, who does what, when, and where is fixed in the mid 18th century and then codified again in the early 19th century, which brings this rivalry more or less to an end. Well, here's then this Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's a very large building with multiple phases. That tower there is part of the main Crusader phase of the building. And of interest here also is to note this small door. That is the only entrance into this large compound, which will be of significance in a moment. And then here is a plan of the church. It takes up a full city block with these various colors identifying which group controls which portion of the church, all these various rooms and side chapels, with the main tomb being this here. And just a couple of incidents worth mentioning, that there's a big fire in the church in 1808, and you have long-lasting conflict, rivalry as to who's going to repair the damage to the fire, because you don't have the groups agreeing with each other over who is going to get the prestige of repairing the damage to the fire. And the rivalry reaches such a point that it actually is a primary cause for the Crimean War. There's some incidents in 1852 in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem that the Russians, as the protectors of the Orthodox, and the French as the protectors of the Catholics, they choose to escalate these incidents, and with other contributing causes. You have the Crimean War in 1853 to 1856, in significant part due to the rivalry as to who is in control of which part of the holy places in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Well, okay, now in the post-Crusader period, Christians who wanted to get into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre need to pay a pilgrim tax to the Muslim authorities. In the first period, it's the Mamluk state, the rulers from Egypt, that pilgrims need to pay. And then it continues when the Ottomans take over in 1517. The Christians need to pay a pilgrim tax. Now, it's not that huge an amount, but it's not that small an amount either. And so those Christians who want to go into the church, both locals and pilgrims, need to pay this tax to be allowed into the building. And so the Christians who do pay the tax are allowed in midday, and then they stay there overnight. The doors of the church will be closed at night, and so you stay there the entire night. There'll be a whole continuous sequence of church services, vigils, vespers, whatever. And if you get tired, you can just find a quiet corner of the building and lie down on the floor and go to sleep. But you're probably going to stay awake all night long with all of the activities of vesper services or vigils or whatever that are going on in the church. And then the next day, the authorities will open the doors and you're let out. And the next group of people who have paid the tax go in and spend the night. Okay, now, yes, then for most of the time, you must pay that tax to get in the church. But during Easter and the other main event, the exaltation of the cross on September 14th, the authorities will let you go in for free. And so this is when the locals go into the church. Easter and the exaltation of the cross on September 15th. Otherwise, locals don't routinely go into the church because you got to pay the pilgrim tax. So it's an oddity that for a lot of the year, the church is mostly empty. You'll have a skeleton crew of Franciscan monks, Greek Orthodox monks, and Armenian monks who are there to see to it that their prerogatives are, maintained and that things go in the proper manner. But you won't necessarily have any lay person inside the church. Now that might sound kind of strange. This is the most important church for Christendom, and for a lot of days, there won't be anybody there other than the custodian Catholic, Orthodox, Armenian monks, because that pilgrim tax that you have to pay is an inhibition to just ordinary lay people to routinely go into the church. But with those two occasions, it's sort of Holy Week up to like the Tuesday after Easter that's free, and then the few days around September 14th with the exaltation of the cross. This commemorates Queen Helena finding the true cross. It also commemorates the dedication date of Constantine's building the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it also commemorates the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who in 628 recovers the true cross that had been taken by the Sasanian Persians when they captured the city of Jerusalem in 614 and take the true cross back to Persia. Well, Heraclius recovers the true cross when he defeats the Sasanians in 628. So it's those three events that constitute the exaltation of the cross commemoration on September 14th, when you can go in without having to pay that tax. Now, there is some documentary evidence indicating just how many people do go into the church. And there happened to be a good document in 1532, this is the early Ottoman period, that records that Christians paid a pilgrim tax amount equivalent to 3,700 people. So that's for 9 months out of the year, 3,700 people more or less paid that tax and got into the church. So that's about 100 people a week, more or less. And some weeks there might not be anybody. Some weeks when a pilgrim ship arrives, it might go up. But there will be times, frequent days, when there is nobody in the church, which I find odd to really recognize, but that tax then is finally abolished in 1832. And after that point, everybody has free access, can go in as they please, leave as they please. The church will still be shut, locked up at night, and then the next morning is open, but there's nobody needing to stay overnight inside the church. And you can come as go as you wish, as often as you wish, starting in 1832. And in today's world, there are people coming in and out in large numbers, ever since then. Okay, well, then the main event of Holy Week, you've got a whole sequence of events that happen, that are scheduled regularly to happen each year inside the church compound, with each denomination doing their own things. But the main event is this miracle of the fire, where the Greek Orthodox patriarch goes into the tomb with a candle, and miraculously this fire descends and lights the candle. And then everybody of the Orthodox faithful who are around have their candles as well, and they take the lighted candle and light their own candle, and so the light of that miraculously lit candle is spread among all of the faithful in the church. And this has been going on every year for well over 1,000 years. In the pre-Crusader times is when there's the first record of this miracle of the fire that descends and miraculously lights the candle that the Greek Orthodox Patriarch is holding inside the tomb. Well, there are critics that say, well, this is obviously fraudulent. There's some sneaky trick that the Patriarch picks to make the candle light, but everybody, all of the faithful agree, no, this is genuine. This is a miracle that happens, and the upright, honest Patriarch would never do something tricky to lead to this candle being lit by a miracle. This is a genuine miracle. Well, you're never going to get any consensus as to, is it a miracle? It happens every year. It will be happening on Saturday. It's Easter Saturday afternoon that this event happens. So it will undoubtedly happen on Saturday. And then here's a photo of the Greek Orthodox faithful who have crowded into the space around the tomb. This is the tomb here, and so you've got this open space with the faithful with their candles lit by the candle that was first lit by this miraculous miracle of the fire. Now, so this is the major event, especially for the Orthodox community. And in 1834, there was a tragic accident when there was a huge crowd. Thousands of people had crammed into this rather small space inside the church, and it was dark, and there was something that triggered a panic and then a stampede, and 400 people get trampled, killed in this stampede that gets triggered by the panic among the enthusiastic Christians there with their candles. So that's the worst incident that happened. And part of the problem is there's only that one small door that I showed you in the previous photograph. That's the only way out of the church, and you've got thousands of people trying to rush out. It's not enough. Well, anyway, so we have that tragic case of 1834 with the stampede killing the 400 Orthodox worshipers in the church. Okay, well, I want to then turn to another event that happens during Holy Week, and that's the commemoration of the Passion of Christ and his move from the place where he is arrested to the place where he is crucified. And the Catholics develop a regularized sequence of events that happened during the time when Jesus is going from the place he's arrested up to the crucifixion, that there are then a number of places worthy of special commemoration. And they come up with a list of 14 separate incidents as Jesus is going along that route. And it's pretty much just a Catholic thing to do. The Orthodox, Armenians, Copts, the other Christian groups don't do this specific activity of processing along the route commemorating these 14 events. So it's very much a Catholic thing to do. And it starts in Jerusalem when the Franciscans established themselves with the custody of the Holy Land being the organizational structure for the Franciscans who are maintaining the holy places and seeing to it that pilgrimage happens in an orderly fashion. They establish themselves, like I mentioned before, 1342, and after that point, you start having once again Roman Catholic, Western European Christians coming to Jerusalem who want to see these 14 stations, which has already become a widespread activity in Europe, in Western Europe. People, Catholics in Europe, have been processing along a commemorative route of these 14 stations. And when they come to Jerusalem, they want to see the authentic 14 stations. So the Franciscans, once they're there in 1342, set up this route with 14 stations. And we know from an especially detailed pilgrimage account by an Italian pilgrim who comes in 1384 and lists exhaustively all of the holy places in the city, including these 14 stations, that for the first time you can see something that is matching more or less what stations of the cross are today. And you then, define a holy place for Catholics as to whether you receive indulgences by visiting these holy places. So this pilgrim provides a very useful information of all of these holy places, meaning all of those places where you can receive indulgences by visiting. And we now have the documentation that it's more or less the 14 stations you have today. Now, the stations, if you attended that Passion play the other day, you have the 14 stations that have become the standard places to go to, and what you do as you are commemorating the events of that final time when Jesus goes from the place where the Romans arrest him and he is condemned to death. He takes up the cross, he falls, he meets his mother. Simon of Cyrene takes the cross from Jesus. Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. This is not a biblical event. This becomes a tradition later. It's not recorded in the Gospels that some woman wipes his face. This is a later tradition that gets added to the 14 things that you're supposed to do. And then Jesus falls again. Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem and says, "Do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children." And then Jesus falls the third time. He's stripped of his garments, he's nailed to the cross, he dies. He's taken down from the cross and is then laid in the tomb. These are the set 14 things that happen that the Roman Catholic faithful are to commemorate. And this, is early on widespread in Europe, and one of the very earliest monumentalizations of these Stations of the Cross is found in the city of Bamberg in Germany, where a pilgrim who had been to Jerusalem comes back to Bamberg in Bavaria in Germany and commissions these artistic renditions depicting what's happening at each of these 14 stations. And this is 1503. This is one of the very first monumentalized artistic representations of the stations. And we have at the bottom down here, the identification. Now this is where Christ speaks to the women of Jerusalem and says, "Do not weep for me, rather weep for yourselves and your children." But then you have at the end here a list of how many steps it is to the next station. This pilgrim carefully recorded how many steps it is from one station to the next in Jerusalem. And when he comes back to Bamberg, he makes sure that these monumentalized depictions are placed the proper distance from each other. So this is one early indication that you've got a clearly identified idea of these 14 stations and how far apart they are, meaning there's now a definitively fixed location in Jerusalem that the pilgrims are to follow. Well, and so then you have, the Franciscans describing all of these holy places that the Roman Catholic faithful are to visit. And we've got this one very interesting map of the route produced by a Franciscan monk who was resident in Jerusalem for much of his career, where he then depicts all of the stations. 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm not making out, 5 would be there, then 6, 7, 8, and then you go out the city in 9 through 14 in what he's depicting as an open field, but it's part of the built-up area of the walled old city today, and you end up in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, this map is very interesting in what Elzevir Horn chooses to depict. And anyway, so then we have, a modern map showing the route with some variation in the exact location of these 14 steps, 14 stations. There's some slight variability in the exact location. Well, okay. So now the problem is these stations are along a public street. This makes the procession visible to the hostile Muslim population of the city. Now, this is a time when the Muslims are dead set against any public display of Christian symbols by the Christian population. This is generally throughout the Muslim territories. You as a Christian may not publicly display crosses or in some way draw attention to yourself as you are processing in a public space. And there's one example where there's a group of hundreds of pilgrims from Ethiopia who come to Jerusalem for Easter in 1516. And this is such a joyous occasion when they finally arrive, because it's not so easy getting from Ethiopia to Jerusalem, that they then start to joyously process through the city streets of Jerusalem with their processional crosses and banners, and they're singing hymns, rejoicing that they finally arrived. Well, this immediately triggers a riot by the hostile Muslim population, who immediately breaks up the procession. There are people killed, wounded, as the Muslims put a stop to this unacceptable public display of Christian symbols. And so these Ethiopians learn the harsh lesson that you can't get uppity if you're a Christian and think you can do what you want. You've got to be careful not to trigger the hostile Muslim population. So you've got the question, how can the Franciscans arrange for pilgrims to proceed along the Via Dolorosa, the the way of sorrows without provoking a riot? So that's a big question that the Franciscans have to solve. I mean, part of their responsibilities for seeing to it that pilgrimage happens in an orderly fashion is to arrange it so that there are no ugly incidents with the hostile Muslim population. That's a major concern. Well, okay, so what they do is rather interesting. So here we've got the route. You start about here and you proceed along this street, down there, and then around to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre there. And then here there's one of the city gates, what's called Lion's Gate today, that goes up to, well, down to the valley where the Garden of Gethsemane is, and then up the hill to the Mount of Olives. The Franciscans will arrange to do the stations in reverse order. You start at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre there, and you go backwards, finishing with Station 1, at the start of a busy day for the pilgrims who then proceed down to the Garden of Gethsemane, up to the Mount of Olives. They loop around to the Lord's Supper building on Mount Zion, and then back to where they are staying in the vicinity of the church. The pilgrim hospices are there. So the first off, it's kind of odd that they do it in reverse order. Okay, and then the second oddity is they do it in the dark. You start when it's still night. You know, just when it's becoming daybreak is when you will start walking in reverse. Well, this is clearly to avoid any contact with the hostile Muslims who are still asleep. If you do it so early, you can get your pilgrim charges out of the city before the Muslims wake up and start their workday. So they do it when there is nobody else in the streets, because it's still not even sunrise yet. Well, so that's how you get it done without provoking a riot. Now, another point is there really aren't all that many Roman Catholic pilgrims in these first centuries. You'll only have a few hundred Western European Christians coming on pilgrimage each year. The travel is so much of a hassle that you only have a few hundred, maybe 2 boats will leave Venice in the spring and arrive in the summertime. There'll be a second time when you might have a boat or a ship or two with a couple hundred pilgrims leaving Venice so that they're there for Christmas. But otherwise, you know, you're not going to have more than maybe 400, 500 total Western pilgrims who are going to want to process along the route of the Stations of the Cross. So it's not like every single day you've got a group of pilgrims that you have to safely get through the gauntlet of the possibly hostile, riotous Muslims. It's only a handful of days each year that this problem arises. And they're mostly successful in doing this so quietly without attracting attention to themselves that there really aren't many hostile, ugly incidents that happen through the Mamluk period. Now, the Mamluks are the people who are ruling Egypt, and they're the ones who finally defeat the Crusaders in the latter part of the 13th century. And that bitter memory of the Crusades is what reinforces the hostility that the locals have in those first centuries. Now, when the Ottomans take control, they are more relaxed. They're not so hostile, and you then have the possibility for the Christians to publicly process without getting too much attracting attention. But it becomes, after 1517, possible for then the Christians to go in the proper order, start with station 1 and end up with station 14 in the church. And they're able to do this publicly, so long as they're not too much drawing attention to themselves. So the Ottomans are freer, less bothered. Well, it's still not incident-free when you have, well, I don't have enough time to say much about any of these stations, but there's a curious thing with these first 2 stations where there's some fluctuation exactly where they are, and sometimes they're on the north side of the street, sometimes on the south side of the street. But anyway, for a time, the Christian pilgrims will be sent by the Muslim authorities inside this building, well, which for a time is a horse stable. Okay, that's the building that the Muslims pick as the place where the Christians will be allowed to go and commemorate one of the stations. Now, the awkwardness arises in that every place that these Christian pilgrims go, they will want to kiss the ground. You'll want to kneel down and kiss the ground, either the soil or the floor of the building where you are. You invariably, as a pilgrim, want to kiss the ground. Now, if you're in a horse stable, that means the floor is going to be covered by a layer of horse manure. And so this is a deliberate thing that the Muslims do. They require these pilgrims to kneel down and kiss horse manure, while the Muslims onlookers are laughing at them and mocking these fools who want to kiss horse manure. Well, that's a sort of ugly incident that the Franciscans would just as soon avoid. But in this case, for some time, it is unavoidable that if you want to kiss the ground at this station, you have to kiss a layer of horse manure. Well, okay, so then the next place to go, as I mentioned, is this building here and this building here, which is an oddity. They're not stations of the cross. But for some reason, the author has shown this building and this very fancy building on his depiction of the route. And this is kind of weird because that larger building is a 14th century Muslim public building. It's an institution for Islamic studies known as a madrasa, built by Mr. Jaharkasiya. Sometime before 1388 is when it was built. Now, this is a major public monument, and the Franciscans decide that it is the house of the rich man. Now, if you remember, there's a parable in the Gospels about the rich man and Lazarus, where Lazarus is this wretch starving in the gutter, and there's this arrogant rich man who refuses to do anything to help Lazarus, to provide him with food or anything. So you've got this parable, and so then when the rich man dies, he goes to hell. Lazarus goes to heaven, where he is living in the bosom of Abraham. And you have then this parable of the evil rich man and the poor wretch Lazarus. The Franciscans choose to identify the location of that rich man's house with this 14th century fancy, ornate, elaborate Muslim educational institute. Why? Well, why do they do it at all? The parable of the rich man and Lazarus has nothing to do with the passion of Christ.
You have 10 minutes left.
10? Okay. Okay, so that's a curiosity. But every Western pilgrim, after this building is built, has it pointed out to them by the Franciscans as they're walking along the Stations of the Cross, even though it has nothing to do with the Passion of Christ. And so then here's another, 19th century drawing of the house of the rich man, and then the house of Lazarus here, which happens to be another public building. It's a Sufi lodge. Now, the Sufis are the mystics. It's built before 1393. It's rather ornate with interesting decorative architectural elements, that this is the house of Lazarus. Well, this is particularly ridiculous to have Lazarus, this poor wretch, living in a fancy mansion. It doesn't fit in the least with the biblical story to have that be the house of Lazarus. Well, today this has long since been forgotten, but in medieval times, up until the mid-19th century, every Western pilgrim is being shown the house of Lazarus and the house of the rich man, as an addition to the Stations of the Cross that the pilgrims do, following what everybody else around the world does. There's no Stations of the Cross in Europe, though I is aware that also choose to show the rich man and Lazarus. But anyway, we have this peculiarity of the Franciscans in Jerusalem adding that to the itinerary of what you do as you walk along the Stations of the Cross. Okay, and then the last aspect I'd like to talk about is an odd Muslim religious event that also is happening during Holy Week. It's the week-long pilgrimage to the tomb shrine of the prophet Moses, which the Muslims identify as being close to Jericho, on the west side of the Jordan River, on the west side of the Dead Sea. There's this shrine, tomb shrine of Moses, that's built by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars in 1263. And this is then a photograph of the compound as built by Baybars with later additions. That's about a 4-hour walk from Jerusalem. And there's this annual pilgrimage that's the largest Muslim religious event of the year. And it's scheduled according to the Orthodox calendar. I don't know of any other Muslim holiday anywhere that is not based on the Islamic calendar. It's based on when the Greek Orthodox commemorate Holy Week. It starts on the Friday before Orthodox Palm Sunday, when you get thousands of Muslim faithful throughout the region gather on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, and then they will process from Jerusalem to this tomb shrine near Jericho, about 4 hours away. They will spend the week in celebrations at the tomb shrine of Moses, and then on Orthodox Good Friday, they will march back from the tomb shrine to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and then have a final, religious, end to that week-long pilgrimage. So now this is a very conscious decision by the Muslim authorities, who pick then to schedule this event. So at a time with Orthodox Good Friday, when the Christian population of the city is at its peak, that's the time when the Muslims choose to schedule this event, where then the Muslim population of the city will be at its peak as a show of strength against the Christians who are at their peak population size. So we've got this curious additional event, an Islamic contribution to the events of Holy Week. In addition to the Jews doing Passover, the Christians doing all the things they do over Easter with the miracle of the fire in particular, and then the others do their, Stations of the Cross or whatever. Then we have at the end the Muslim contribution of rivaling what the Christians are doing. Okay, so that's the end of my talk, and thanks for listening to what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.